Good evening and welcome everyone to our special CTP webinar edition this evening on the topic of grief, surviving the depths, a panel discussion on grief. My name is Michael Bräutigam and I am directing the Center for Theology and Psychology at Melbourne School of Theology and Eastern College. And on behalf of my whole team, I'm delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you as you are joining us for this topic. It seems to be an important topic that we're touching on. I just see the numbers go up here, and we have quite a few number of people registered for this webinar. So it is important to talk about grief. And I'm also delighted that we have three distinguished panelists this evening. We have Judy Lillis and Greg Chain and Matt Jacoby. And they will be sharing a bit about, their own experiences with grief, obviously about scripture and theology, and also bringing some insights from psychology to the table. So it's going to be an integrated discussion and conversation. Yeah, by the way, it aims to be a conversation. So it's not just our experts talking to you, but you can ask questions. You'll see that at the bottom of your Zoom program, you have a Q&A option, and you can click on that. And during the talks, anytime whatsoever, just post your questions there. Secondly, you can also upvote questions. If you see, oh, that's a great question, I always wanted to ask that question myself, you just put the thumbs up and the question gets upvoted. That's how we do it. So our plan for this evening is that we have first Judy, then Greg, and then Matt. And each of our presenters will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes. And that gets us to 7:45 or so, roughly. And then for the last section, the last 45 minutes, we will have Q&A. So plenty of opportunity to engage, to ask questions, and to hear what our panelists are saying. Beautiful. I hope I've mentioned everything I'm supposed to mention. And then I can now introduce our first speaker. And I'm delighted that Judy is joining us here this evening. Judy Lillis. Judy has a lived experience of grief, having had her infant son pass away from a congenital heart defect in 2004. Professionally, she has degrees in psychology and educational counseling from the USA and the bereavement counseling intervention in Australia. She has previously worked in counseling roles in school settings and in grief counseling as a practitioner associate with Grief Australia and in private practice. And Judy also serves on our board at CTP. Judy will share about her personal experience of loss, characteristics of grief, and how we support those who are grieving. Thank you, Judy, and over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And I'll just give me a second to share my screen. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be able to be here and to be able to share with you some insights from both my personal experience and my story of my son Andrew's life, as well as the work, the things that I've learned as a grief counselor. So when grief arrived, it was a moment for me that changed everything, a moment frozen in time. Like many others I experienced during autumn of 2003. I recall it so clearly. The doctors sat before us after our pregnancy scan telling us that our baby had a major heart defect called hypoplastic left heart syndrome. They drew us a picture of his broken heart, which would require 3 surgeries for a chance to survive. There really isn't anything that could have prepared us for that moment. I felt like my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces, and as we wrapped our heads around what this diagnosis meant for us and for him, we knew that we would fight for Andrew as much as we could to give him every chance at the life that the Lord may have for him, no matter what we had to face. A few weeks later, they found a serious kidney defect as well, and it brought lots of challenges, still trying to parent our 3-year-old son as best we could. with complex pregnancy filled with lots of procedures, including fetal surgery at 24 weeks. So what my husband and Tom and I went through during Andrew's pregnancy was both physically, emotionally painful, and at times traumatic. And I grieved during this time for so many reasons, especially for what the future could have looked like. Despite the challenges we faced, we were filled with hope. At 34 weeks, Andrew was born by an emergency cesarean and taken to the ICU as his lungs were not functioning. My son gave him the nickname Baby Andrew Valentine's Baby as he was born on the 13th of February, a day before Valentine's Day 2004. He had a soft, fuzzy head of hair and looked like his father. And a few hours after his birth, he was baptized by the hospital chaplain. And it was a most precious moment filled with conflicting feelings of happiness for his life and baptism and grief because he was so extremely sick. If he had lived, Andrew would be 19 years old now. We had just 6 short, precious days with him, and the condition of his lungs and kidneys, along with his heart defect, meant he could not survive. On the day he went to the Lord, the doctor said they could do no more for him, and we removed his life support. He passed away peacefully in my arms, surrounded by family, on the 19th of February, 2004. Leaving the hospital without him the next day was the start of a painful grief process that would at times feel like the weight of bricks on my chest, that a piece of myself was missing, or that I had cried until no more tears were left to cry. Grief is not easy. However, as I prepared to share his life with you, I wondered, how would I express to you in words the depth of my pain, grief, and loss, but also how the struggle and my reliance on the Lord has filled me with hope and an even deeper, unshakable faith. The illness and death of Andrew changed me for the better. I grew through these years to have a total reliance on the Lord, to trust in him and not my own ways or understanding. My life, whilst grieving or in happiness, is lived with his word as my anchor. Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, and in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. The loss of Andrew is one that my head will never be able to make sense of, and yet with my heart, I surrender to the Lord's plans for Andrew. And I acknowledge he is in control of my life, and I thank him for all I have. And I'm grateful for the days of my pregnancy with Andrew and the 6 days of life. My grief never fully goes away, but when it rises up, I turn to the Lord for strength. And I hope that over the next few minutes, I can share a few things which may help someone who is suffering a loss. This verse from 1 Thessalonians reminds me that as a Christian, I do not grieve without hope. And I can hold on, my experience shows me that I can hold on to the hope that Jesus' death on the cross provides, while at the same time acknowledging that grief and pain and separation from Andrew. The depth of my grief does not imply a lack of my faith, and I'm able to rest in the fact that the love of Jesus gives me strength and hope for a future. I find this drawing says a lot. It's extremely hard to put into words to tell someone how you feel when grief impacts so much of your life and it impacts you so deeply. This list from the Australian Psychological Society has both emotional, cognitive, and physical and behavioral reactions that you have. And grief is a natural process. It's a natural response to a loss, and it can be from a death. However, there are many other types of loss, such as divorce, disability, family estrangement, illness, and more. Anticipatory grief is a type of grief that can occur when you're facing an impending loss, such as death from a terminal illness. And everyone will not experience all of these responses that are listed here. However, you can see from the list that it can be surprising what a wide impact it has. Grief is very physical. I found that in my loss, I had migraines and tiredness that were my constant companions. And with the death of my baby, my arms ached and I had physical tightness in my chest and back. And it felt like there was a hole in my being, as if I'd lost a part of myself. I no longer knew who I was. Now, I note that the APS list here leaves out something important, and that's the spiritual aspects for our grief that can be so important to our experience. So this picture on the right is something that I created through a website called wordart.com. Much of the functionality is free on wordart.com, and it allows you to express with words and shapes feelings that you have. So what does my grief feel like? This picture on the right is an expression of the physicality of the grief that I felt. Now, there are some things that I've learned about grief professionally and personally. We've learned that And over the next few slides, I'll share a few different things about that. So I've learned that everyone grieves differently. There is no right or wrong way to grieve, and it can bring up feelings, lots of feelings and reactions, which are different in different people, and the way you cope may be different too. There are also grieving styles you can see from the picture on the right, and it talks about the way that people cope with grief. And knowing that people can grieve differently, it really helps when someone in your family might be reacting differently to you. Intuitive grievers like to openly express their feelings and emotions and talk about their grief to process. Instrumental grievers feel more comfortable using actions or distractions to process their grief. And blended grievers are a mix of both. My own example, in my own family, we did grieve differently. And I wanted to talk about my grief, whereas my husband did not want to talk about the way he was feeling. He felt more comfortable doing things such as getting a tattoo in memory of Andrew, or visiting the cemetery, or planting something special in our yard. So we did the things that we could together, and when I needed to talk more about my feelings, I attended a grief support group for grief parents. Mostly it's helpful to know that when you grieve differently, it's okay to seek support from others, such as a counselor, psychologist, social worker. I've also learned another thing, and that is that grief is not linear. When we consider theories of grief, you may have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. On Death and Dying, she wrote of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But newer models, such as William Worden's Tasks of Grief, recognize that grief is not a linear process with discrete stages that you move through. It's more of a back and forth and up and down process, and there is no timeline to grief. There is also the idea of continued bonds from Klass and Silverman, which says you don't have to detach, move on, and cut yourself off in grief to move through. You can honor the love that you have for a person or value the good things from something you've lost while still discovering how to live in a world that's been changed by grief. You can do this through things such as lighting candles on an anniversary, visiting places that are special, or making an item from their clothing, music, etc. And this was a really comforting idea to me, that I didn't have to cut myself off completely from his memory. Growing around grief is a model that's described by Louis Tonkin in 1996. And I think for myself personally, I found this the most helpful in thinking about loss. So you can see from the diagram that at the start, grief, which is shown in red, it's all consuming. The circle represents you, and it's an all consuming part of the circle. The grief is just completely taking up the whole circle. And with the bottom set of circles, you can see that over time, grief doesn't shrink. You see that redness is still the same. And it's a common myth that people will just get over their grief. Feelings can be just as intense at times. However, life begins to expand and grow around grief, and you can experience joy again. Part of us always grieves for the person who's died or the thing you've lost, but in time, the pain lessens, but it's still a part of us, and we learn to live with a new normal. My personal experience, this was the case, and my love for Andrew and the amount that I miss him hasn't changed. There's still a piece of myself missing with his death. However, my life did grow around the grief for Andrew. I could smile again, laugh again at silly things, and rediscover myself, and literally stop and smell the roses in the amazing world that the Lord has created for us. Another thing is that grief causes secondary losses in other areas of our life. And some too that were really impacted in my life were identity and friendships. And I felt completely changed as a person, my identity. Some things that used to be important to me no longer were, and I needed to start to discover who I was after Andrew's death. And friendships, some of my close friends were not the ones that I could go to in my grief. My friendships changed, and it was sad, but I found those I could connect with. One additional thing to mention is that sometimes grief is not able to be shared. Disenfranchised grief is a loss that's not openly acknowledged or socially mourned or publicly supported. And some examples are a miscarriage, an inability to have children, losing someone to suicide. It could be the loss of a job, a pet, a relationship, friendship. And you may not feel you can express grief. Ambiguous loss also, it makes it hard to share. And Mayo Clinic describes this as a profound sense of loss and sadness that's not associated with death of a loved one. So it's facing a situation without a resolution, such as if you're living with a loved one who has dementia or addiction or mental ill health, or if there's a missing person or a soldier missing in action where there's no closure. So some things that were helpful and that maybe you would find helpful too. Of course, prayer. I had a really handy list of Bible verses that I kept with me that were important to me that I could go to whenever I was feeling distressed for prayer. Dosing of grief. It's the idea that it's okay to give yourself permission to take a break for a few minutes intentionally from grief. Watch a comedy show, enjoy flowers in your garden. Taking a break is good for your body and brain. And if you're grieving the loss of someone, it's not dishonoring to them. It's important to look after yourself. Anniversary reactions. Often I found in working with others that the anticipation and the lead up to an anniversary can be worse than the actual day. So having a plan for how to spend the day helps. Stugs. It's a funny word, but it's a sudden and temporary upsurge of grief. And these can happen when you least expect them, and even after much time has passed. Even 19 years later, I can sometimes have surprising grief reactions. And when I recognize that's happening, I kind of recognize it, but I also know the intensity will pass. Expressing what the loss means is really important, and there's many creative ways to do it. For myself, I use music and collage journaling, photos, scrapbooking, dance, but it depends on what is important to you. We also memorialize by visiting the cemetery together for birthdays and having scones there and making his birthday a celebration and something that was always included with our family. Metaphors in grief. I think it's really important to be able to put words to what you're feeling and what your grief is like for you. Grief has been sometimes described as a storm or in waves or as a roller coaster. When Andrew first died, I remember a trip to the grocery store, which should have been a normal experience, but it felt like I'd landed in a foreign land, and it was a whole different experience. There were mums and bubs everywhere, living life, and it felt like my world had stopped. It was very painful. Now, most people will journey through grief with just having the help of their family, friends, the Lord, and their church family, and they don't require professional help. However, having counseling can provide a safe space to share what the loss means and to find a way to maintain a connection to the person or the thing that you lost while learning to live in that changed world. Now, sometimes grief can persist beyond a long time, but also beyond normal activities of your daily living. And it's incapacitating and unsubsiding. And this is more at risk when you have a sudden or a traumatic loss. And then it would be important to try and seek help. Now, it's normal to wrestle with difficult questions when you have grief. And this was an experience of me. And there's a book that I read by Reverend Andy Percy, and it's called When Rain Falls Like Lead. I'm going to share a picture of the book on the next screen. But my experience that this was a big part of strengthening my faith and being able to come to the Lord with these difficult questions in my grief, to lament and not feel I wasn't a good person if I did. God was with me in the middle of my pain. And Andrew Percy says that we can ask questions in grief that we may find hope and holy ground where we're honest with each other and God. So here's the book that you can find at Koorong and or other booksellers. Now he shares, he's a reverend who shares about the suffering that he experienced after the sudden death of his sister to a stroke. She was just in her early 20s and newly married. And he really does go into the depths of what it feels like to be in this place of deep suffering. I really identified with what he was saying in the book. And you may too. Companioning others in loss. So the Lord, my experience is that the Lord is the ultimate companion in our grief. And Andy Percy that I mentioned before, he mentions that because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. This is Lamentations 3:22. And he is light in the darkness. We're not alone. And companioning others, I was transformed by God's presence, and I wanted to be able to support others with listening and compassion. So I decided to, but you too can also offer the kind of support to others who are grieving. So supporting others who are grieving, this is from Grief Australia, just a few things. I'm not going to read all of them, but I will just say that grief is such an individual experience, and it's really helpful to find out what someone needs. You can't assume to know what someone needs since it is so individual. An example is someone who was grieving the loss of her husband for many years, and she was preparing to go to church and felt like she didn't want to have to talk about the loss of her husband when she was there. And she really hoped to be able to chat to other people about their lives, what was happening, and things that might be a distraction for her. So by asking someone you would know something like that, you can just offer them the support that they would like. So being there and listening, your presence can be helpful even if you don't know what to say. There are some helpful websites here if you'd like to take a photo or screenshot. They do provide a lot of resources, info sheets, and more information about grief. And references here, again, you're welcome to take a photo if you'd like. So I'd really like to thank you for allowing me to share tonight. And I'll pass you back to Michael so that he can introduce the next presenter, and I look forward to the end when we can answer some of the questions. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Judy, for sharing with us really so openly and honestly. That was really kind of you to go through that and to share from your own experience. I'm sure that wasn't that easy, but you're serving us in amazing ways here this evening. So thank you so much. And for those of you who have just joined, or maybe just a few minutes ago, please feel free to post your questions. If you have any questions for Judy, for instance, post them in the Q&A section, and you can also upvote questions which you find intriguing. You can put a thumbs up and the question moves up, and we'll talk about your questions in the second part of our webinar today. And thank you again, Judy. Our next speaker is Greg Chain, and Greg is joining us from Perth. Greg is a clinical psychologist with degrees in psychology and philosophy, and he's currently serving as director of Hills Psychology and Wellness and Manor Wellness in Perth. His previous work includes supporting people in hospital settings such as the State Major Trauma Unit, psychiatric inpatient and outpatient settings, and also families with genetic I can't say the word. Can you say it, Greg?
Neurodegenerative. You're making me find it hard to say it now, Michael.
It's a difficult word. Difficult conditions, right? And Greg will consider the potentially problematic ways that culture and individuals think about and manage grief. Thank you so much, Greg, for taking the time to join us here and all the way from Perth. And we look forward to hearing more from you. Over to you.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just share my screen and start up this slideshow. Thank you for joining us, everyone. I guess the title of my presentation is Defenses of Clay, Understanding the Ways We Manage Pain. I guess as a clinical psychologist, I want to primarily have the focus of how we can support others in grief, but it will overlap a little bit into, I guess, how we can manage grief and suffering well ourselves. So I just wanted to start with a story. When I was working on the State Major Trauma Unit, I was a newly minted psychologist, and I received a referral from the consultant psychiatrist to see a woman who had recently been admitted to the ward, who had, very sadly, had something quite shameful happen in her life, and then she tried to slit her own throat and to kill herself. The consultant psychiatrist gave me the task of, and I was a little bit confused by the referral, but gave me the task of doing anxiety management with her. I went over to her room and gingerly entered the room. It was very dark and was, pretty heavy atmosphere. And I, very quietly just said, "Oh, hi Maria. I'm Greg. I'm a clinical psychologist in the ward, and I'm here just to check how you're going." The consultant psychiatrist must have been just at the outside the door, and he burst into the room and said, "No, Greg. This is how you do it." And then he proceeded to tell Maria this. He said, "Hi, Maria. This is Greg, and he's going to do some anxiety management techniques with you." And he said, "Okay," and then he just left the room. I was quite taken back by the experience. I personally don't think that was a good way to manage a really delicate situation. And I guess, like, on reflection, I would say that as clinicians, and probably been a little bit hard on this consultant psychiatrist, but I think as clinicians and as people that are helping people to manage grief and suffering, we have to be very careful that we don't allow our own anxieties to dictate the process. And it can be very easy to fall into the trap of providing a strategy or providing some quick fix to try to feel like that we're doing something in a situation that can feel like we can't fix it. There's a quote by Ernest Becker, and it says this. He says this: "I think that taking life seriously means something such as this, that whatever man does on this planet has to be done in the lived truth of the terror of creation, of the grotesque, of the rumble of panic underneath everything." So I want to do the overview of, I guess, my little presentation before we do our Q&A later is I want to discuss the ways we manage grief. I want to discuss the ways that we manage grief in an immanent or secular frame currently in culture. I want to discuss how we manage grief with our own particular meaning, how we do it with our own particular psychological defenses, and fourthly, how we do it with or without the hope of the resurrection. So an important concept that I want to discuss is in our current culture, Charles Taylor would make this comment about the way that people generally think about the universe and reality. So he says this: "So the buffered identity of the disciplined individual moves in a constructed social space where instrumental rationality is a key value and time is pervasively secular. All of this makes up what I want to call the immanent frame. There remains to add just one background idea, that this frame constitutes a natural order to be contrasted with a supernatural one, an immanent world over against a possible transcendent one." And I found this really lovely picture online. It's an album cover. I had never listened to this band before. I did listen to them shortly after I found the picture, and they seem quite good. But the picture represents Charles Taylor's idea very beautifully. And so basically what Charles Taylor is saying, that in our current culture, there's an idea, a pervasive idea, that anything that exists, anything that we should consider to be possible, it exists within the frame of what we can see and touch and taste and what we can observe through scientific inquiry. And why he thinks this is problematic is that it actually cuts off important parts of reality that might give meaning to our experience and actually might make our experience make sense. If you look at the picture, it's a picture of a tree, and the frame cuts off the very roots of the tree, which I think everyone would agree is a very important part of a tree, and also the leaves and the flowering of the tree, where all that's left is the sparse branches and trunk. And so why I think this is a really important idea is that it actually impacts upon the way that we understand suffering and we understand grief. If we grieve or suffer in an immanent frame where there's no roots to it, there's no transcendent reality, where there's a God and there's meaning, then when we suffer and when we experience grief, it just feels like an anomaly that doesn't make sense, and it can leave us without hope. It can also lead to us as clinicians or counsellors or people trying to comfort people who are suffering to give all sorts of reasons and strategies that become very, very unhelpful to the person that's suffering. So the next thing I want to lead on to is the idea of the meaning of suffering. In Tim Keller's book, Walking Through Pain and Suffering of God, he talks about the ideas, and I don't think it's his idea, but I'm a big Tim Keller fan, so a lot of my ideas seem to come from him. But he talks about the ideas of theodicies. And so a theodicy is basically an explanation for why somebody might be suffering. And so in life, there are times that there is suffering or there is grief, and the reason for that grief is revealed. Even in a scriptural sense, there's times where people have suffered or they have experienced grief or loss, where we understand why the reason is. So for one example, you have Pharaoh in the Old Testament, in Exodus. He experiences a degree of pain, suffering, loss, even the loss of his firstborn child. And the reason is given. The reason is that he is being disobedient to God and being defiant. We know that an innocent man in the Bible suffered, our Lord Jesus. We know the reason why he suffered. He suffered that he might make a sacrifice for sin, and he suffered for us. And so there's times in the Bible and there's times in life where the reason for our suffering, it's obvious and it's revealed. But there's times where we suffer and there's times where we experience loss where the reason isn't revealed and it's actually veiled. And this can be really confusing and it can be really destabilizing. And so if we look at the book of Job, the, um, the error that Job's friends made when they tried to comfort Job, when Job experienced a high degree of suffering, so many losses, so many things that he could not solve, the error that Job's friends made after they did actually do the right thing and sit with him in the dust, the error they made was try to give him a whole list of theodicies, a whole list of reasons why that he was suffering. Some of them was that he was being disobedient, and what Job says to his friends. So I think they were incredibly unhelpful, and he expressed this when they're trying to give him these reasons. He says, "You, however, smear me with lies. You are worthless physicians, all of you." And so the point is, and I kind of link back to the consultant psychiatrist I mentioned at the start. If we hold a level of anxiety about suffering, if we want to explain it very quickly to appease our own fears and to appease our own terror, to maybe give a reason why we don't need to suffer ourselves if we just do the right thing. Uh, the reason why I bring that up is we have to be in a position where we can actually sit with people in their suffering, and we don't try to just give lots of reasons to appease our own anxiety. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of meaning, and Judy touched on this really beautifully, is that there's a different meaning of loss for everyone. So I'll give you a couple of examples of times where I've spoken to people who have been suffering. One, I think I was helpful, and the second one I probably wasn't. So the first one is a man, Mark. I was visiting him in hospital. I'd been called to see him because he was experiencing a high degree of depression while he was on an inpatient ward. I came and spoke to him, and interestingly enough, it wasn't his injury that he wanted to talk about, but it was actually the fact that he was in hospital and his wife had actually committed suicide while being in the care of mental health services. And the biggest thing that he was struggling with was trusting his care to a system that he felt like they had let down his wife. And one of the things that was really helpful for him, and I did take a bit of a leap with this, but I said to Mark, I said, Mark, when you tell me about the type of incompetence and the type of insincerity that your wife was treated with in the hospital system, it makes me wonder if there is a hell and that people who do the wrong thing by one another, that they will be held to account. And Mark found it incredibly helpful to the point where after his discharge from hospital, he called up and thanked me for the help that I had given him just in that comment. And so for Mark, the meaning of his grief, there was actually rage and there was actually a sense of injustice that he was unable to move on from. And so him understanding that there might be a transcendent reality where people who do the wrong thing will be judged was a helpful concept for him. However, an instance where I probably was unhelpful and I just didn't read the room enough was where once this is actually in a personal situation. I walked into a house where a group of people had lost their mother, and the siblings who had lost their mother, they were older adults, and they were sitting around in a circle. And I went to console them, not too much, but just to say that the usual condolences. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. And the person, strangely enough, one of the people turned around to me and said, no, I'm sorry for you. And it was just really strange because while I knew the person that had died, I wasn't anywhere near as close to the person as the daughter of the person that had deceased. And the meaning of the suffering for this person was, and I didn't quite get it in the moment, I had to reflect on it. To actually grieve for that person, that actually meant for them to be vulnerable and weak, and it was something that they were very uncomfortable with. And so for that person, you actually have to be really careful not to be too tender and too gentle, because they'll actually experience it as shameful. And so that leads me to my next point, and that's on how we all will employ different psychological defenses to manage distressing emotions and attacks on the self and our beliefs about reality. So often when death comes or where suffering comes, it can shatter our reality and cause a lot of distress and anxiety in us. In the book of Job, it talks about, Job again says this to his friends, which he wasn't very happy with when they were trying to help him. So in Job chapter 6, verse 21, he says, now you two have proved to me no help. You see something dreadful and are afraid. And so what Job's identifying there is the people that are trying to help him in his grief and his pain, they are unable to help him because they see the dreadfulness of suffering and of pain and of death, and they're too afraid to actually help him. They have to actually console themselves with the way that they're helping him. In Job chapter 13, verse 12, he says this. He says, your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. And so when we're helping other people to grieve, we have to be very careful that we don't just implement psychological defenses while we're sitting in the pain with them, so that we actually neglect the person. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples. I won't go through all of them where that might be the case. One I'll throw myself under the bus when I was training as a psychologist. So one psychological defense, it's actually considered to be quite a mature psychological defense, but can be unhelpful at times, is humor. So when I was a training as a clinical psychologist at university, we had to video all of our sessions so that we could get feedback. And I was sitting with my supervisor, who was an excellent supervisor, and we were watching myself with a client, and the client was telling us something very distressing. When the client was telling the distressing content, he was also laughing at the same time. And at the time, I was a bit underdeveloped as a clinician, and I laughed along with the client. My very proficient supervisor, he paused the video, looked at me and said, Greg, what was that? And I said, I don't know. He was laughing, I was laughing too. And he just looked at me and he said, don't do it. And the reason why it was such a helpful moment for me was because he helped me to realize that it was too painful for the person to sit in what they were sitting in. And then when I laughed along, I actually showed the client that I'm unable to sit with the distress as well. And it actually gave the impression to the client that people can't sit with him in painful things. And so that's why we have to be careful that we don't use humor too much when we're trying to deal with pain. I'll just give one more example of a psychological defense so I don't go too long. But rationalization is another psychological defense that can be very helpful at times, but sometimes unhelpful with grief. In the same way that Job's friends gave lots of rationalizations why he was suffering, it can be unhelpful for a clinician or a comforter to give lots of rationalizations about somebody's loss or their pain. For example, if somebody has had a loss, that they've lost a person, if you go in too quick and try to give a theodicy, a reason why the loss has occurred, it can actually be incredibly unhelpful because it actually might not be true and it's not comforting to the person. And so finally, I just want to touch on this. So we could grieve and grieve with others, with or without the hope of the resurrection. And I don't want, I think Matt's probably going to, speak a lot more about this, I think, in the context of Psalms. But just two things. So as a comforter, if we have the hope of the resurrection, we can sit in the rumble of panic underneath everything with people and hold their pain, because we won't be overcome with terror, because we know that God will give us back everything that we lose one day. And then secondly, for the sufferer can have a hope that we will receive back what we have lost. And the loss can be a part of an intricate story rather than a closed, chaotic universe. And that's why it's important to have an open frame rather than an imminent frame, I think, when we're thinking about suffering. There's just a couple of references there and books for further reading. So Timothy Keller, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. Nancy McWilliams, it's just a really great book about understanding personality structure and psychological defenses. It is a textbook. And then finally, Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, where he talks about this idea about an imminent frame. And finally, just some copyright slide there. All right, that's thank you for listening, guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg, for your stimulating presentation, bringing together insights from psychology and a bit of philosophy even, and also theology, your reading of scripture, beautiful. And I'm sure you have questions for Greg. If you want, you are more than welcome to post your questions in the Q&A section here on Zoom. Wonderful. We continue with Dr. Matt Jacoby. And it's good to have you with us here this evening. Matt, thanks for joining us. Matt Jacoby is a lecturer in Christian thought and preaching at Melbourne School of Theology. And in addition to his role at MST, Matt is the senior pastor of One Hope Baptist Church in Geelong. Matt is the author of Deeper Places, a book that explores the spirituality of the Psalms. Highly recommended. Thanks for writing that, Matt. And Matt will talk about the expression of grief in the Psalms and how the Psalms demonstrate the role of faith in experiences of grief and suffering. Thanks for joining us, Matt, and over to you.
Thanks, Michael. It's good to be here and to talk about this very important topic. It's a topic that is played out in the Psalms in some very interesting ways, and so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to see if this works. All right, there we go. So that's my book on the spirituality of the Psalms does include some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So a little bit of promotion there for that. It's also been made into a small group resource and for churches to use as well. So there are, I think, some very important aspects of the spirituality of the Psalms that have unfortunately become quite countercultural today, even within our the sort of spiritual environment that we create in churches. So there are aspects of the Psalms that I think we desperately need to try to cultivate. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. One of the key things that happens, and this is a bit of a worldview perspective. Christian worldview is one of the philosophy-related subjects that I teach at MST. Is what we see in the Psalms is really a validation of grief. And what I mean by this is that the Psalms they form a remarkable contrast to what is to what it, to a way of thinking, or a way of approaching grief that I would describe as being something more like Stoicism. Stoicism was the most prominent philosophy in the first century, the time when Jesus was on earth, and even sort of in the next 150 years, it was gradually supplanted by Christianity. But there are a lot of elements of Stoicism that just got Christianized, and Stoics believed, and I'm saying this because I think there's a really important contrast in biblical spirituality, and the Psalms very much portray biblical spirituality. There's a contrast to this. So Stoicism had this idea that the universe unfolds in this perfectly rational way. It kind of expands and contracts and expands and contracts, and it only ever expands in the one perfectly rational way. Everything that happens, there's a reason for everything that happens. And when something seemingly bad happens, the Stoic teaching is a little bit simplistic, but the Stoics taught that you need to approach that, and you probably even heard this term used. You need to approach it philosophically, and even the sort of popular idea of handling grief or suffering in a Stoic manner. That's what this means, and it means to recognize. It means to recognize that that this is the way it had to be. There's a reason for everything. We don't always see that reason, but we've just got to accept that this is the best of all possible worlds, to use a term that the philosopher Leibniz used, who was quite influenced by Stoicism. And we've just got to accept that. Now, actually, as you listen to that, that may sound to you like a Christian way of thinking. You may even heard people talk like that, but it's not only is that not a biblical way of thinking, but it's a very unhelpful, and can I say, as a pastor, it's a very unhelpful. It's one of the more unhelpful ways that you can respond when coming alongside someone in grief. Of course, the biblical worldview perspective is that this perfectly ordered world, was thrown into chaos through the collective sin of humankind. And in this chaotic situation, things aren't as they're meant to be. Suffering and death and evil, they're not part of some sort of rational, rational unfolding of the universe. They're just bad. It's not the way that things are meant to be, and God is doing something about that. God is working in the world. God works through in the midst of all of that, and His sovereign purpose is fulfilled over the top of all of that. And ultimately, God is going to bring about a new heavens and a new earth, and there is a very much a future orientation to Scripture. In the meantime, we have hope. Now, what gives us hope? And this brings me to the Psalms. Well, first of all, according to Paul in Romans, he says, suffering produces perseverance, which produces character, which produces hope. It is our embeddedness in the brokenness of this world that actually creates hope. One form of loss of hope is seeing nothing beyond the here and now, but probably another very common source of loss of hope is, in a sense, getting too comfortable or liking this too much. We're told in the Bible, do not love the world. And in this scripture here, Paul says, and I'll just take it from halfway because we're a little short on time. Paul says, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. By this hope, he says, we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. This groaning that Paul talks about, this is what we see in the lament psalms. And over half the psalms in the Psalter are lament psalms. And the lament psalms, like Psalm 22, this is what that groaning looks like. And in a sense, what Paul is saying is, as we groan inwardly, because we have the first fruits of the Spirit, it's that the groaning is not the result of being unspiritual. It's actually the opposite. Because, of course, we live in the valley of the shadow of death, to use that line from Psalm 23. This world, we are broken people living in a very, very broken world. God doesn't want us to like it. He wants to anticipate what he is bringing about. He wants to connect with what he's doing now and anticipate what he is bringing about. That is hope. That's what hope is. It's the anticipation for what God is bringing about. And I think this worldview perspective is important because it means that, when we are struck through illness or bereavement, or when we are struck with our mortality, with that brokenness, it's not as though and sometimes, I think we can respond as though, the wind of some other reality blew open the windows of our little heaven. But according to the biblical worldview, we don't live in heaven. We're still on earth, and it's very broken. It's not another reality. This really is the very, very sad and grievous reality that we live in, and that's the worldview of Scripture. That's the worldview of the Psalms, and this is important because Psalms like Psalm 22, they validate grief. It's and they validate the fact that it's just bad. That there's deep intuitive sense that. When we lose someone that we love, that it's just bad. It's just wrong. It's just not right that it should be this way. And of course, famously, Jesus' response to the death of Lazarus, even though he did in that situation have a purpose for allowing Lazarus to die, I think there's still an inscrutable, there was still plenty of inscrutable elements to that purpose. But it says, this is, of course, the famous shortest verse in the Bible. It says Jesus wept. He didn't philosophize it away. He didn't emphasize the reason first up and sort of calmly, deal with that calmly. No, he wept because he was grieved by this thing called death, because it was not meant to be the case. And of course, he was doing something that was going to conquer death and lead us ultimately to resurrection into a new heavens and the new earth. One of the things that is profound, I think, about the Psalms is the full expression that they give to grief. And we see this here in Psalm 22. I won't read it, but one of the great things about this psalm, of course, is the fact that this is a psalm, a number of lines. The first line of this psalm, I should say, this is what Jesus quoted on the cross. And so there is a sense in which in doing that, Jesus is really inhabiting this position of grief. He is inhabiting our suffering. He is taking our suffering, is sharing our suffering. And in sharing our suffering, even Jesus experiences this grief, this complaint. And the use of Psalm 22 there, I think, just beautifully illustrates the way that Jesus enters into our suffering and therefore is able to comfort us. I'm going to move on from Psalm 22. There's plenty to read there. I've talked about hope and suffering in the Psalms. one of the key things in the Psalms, and I think this is a really important point, is in the midst of grief, one of the most common things that the Psalms are praying is always that they would find God in the midst of the situation. It's actually not primarily that the situation of hardship would be taken away. Primarily the psalmist, as we see here in these Psalms, my eyes fail looking for God. In Psalm 42, put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God. Psalm 42, of course, begins with the words, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. And I think this is important because one of the things that I've experienced in the pastoral space with Christians, because we believe that God can do anything and we believe that God can heal, sometimes that can actually have us grasping onto that. And I know in a number of instances that I've experienced that people facing death can actually hold on to this, and it can actually rob them of really finding God in the midst of their grief, because they're holding on to the promise of healing or the resolution of their situation of hardship, so much so that they actually never really get a chance to find peace in the midst of it. And one of the most remarkable things about the Psalms, and some pretty, there's some pretty grievous situations going on in the Psalms. The most remarkable thing in the Psalms is the way in which the psalmists find God and find peace before anything changes in their circumstances. And because they find hope in the midst of their circumstances, not dependent on whether God makes it go away. And I think this is really a really important point, and it's just an issue that I've seen come up, particularly with Christians facing these sorts of situations. Just quickly too, one of the things also that's important about the Psalms is that they invite us to communal lament. And when in situations of suffering in the context of the Psalms, there's lots of we statements. Look what's lamenting what's happened to us, and this is based on these ideas in Romans is mourn with those who mourn. In Corinthians, Paul says if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. And you get this sense actually in Psalm 80, when the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed and those in the south in Judah, there was a lot of rivalry between the two. But when the northern kingdom was wiped out, they really grieved that. And I think this is an important principle, because grieving with others prepares us for when we suffer grief. And one of the biggest issues that I alluded to before is in the church is the loss of this whole genre of spiritual expression, the genre of lament. The loss of this, I think, has robbed us of ways of grieving communally that can actually teach us how to grieve as we grieve with other people, so that when our turn comes, there's a sense in which we have learned to grieve in a faith-filled way. I think I'll leave that there. I'm out of time, so thanks for listening, and back to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Matt, for taking us to the deeper places. Really, these places there of lament that are so important to us, and so that they really come alive. I find as you talk about it, these old texts, they're so relevant today as we, as you mentioned at the end, together lament and come together and grieve. So thank you to our presenters, to our panelists. And now there's the option for you to engage, to ask questions that you may have. I'm sure the panelists have raised quite a few questions. These have been really stimulating talks. So feel free to post them on the Q&A, and if you upvote them, they move up in the list, and I'll make sure those with the highest upvotes get asked and then answered as well. Beautiful. Let's start here. Let me see. We've got here a comment from Judy. That's answered. And another comment, not a question. Thank you for sharing. Beautiful. And then there's a question here for Judy. Judy, thanks for your presentation. My questions are, what is right way healthy grief or wrong way unhealthy grief? Is there time limit for grieving? Yeah, that's a good question. If yes, how long? If no, would the prolonged grief cause a ripple effect into other life issues? Would you like to answer that, Judy?
There's a lot of questions in that question.
Yes.
But, thank you for asking. And the right way and the wrong way of grieving, and it's a difficult one because I think society has a lot that they have to say about right and wrong grieving. But one of the models that I used a lot is actually one that someone mentioned in the comments further down, to help people talk about their, like, the movement in grief and whether they're, sort of stuck in grief, so to speak, is called the dual process model. And it really talks about the ability to be able to, in grief, spend time in honoring your grief, being able to put into words your grief, being able to express your lament. And then there's the other side of grief. So I kind of used to draw this butterfly model where there's two wings of a butterfly. And with grief, you kind of want to be able to move back and forth between life-oriented things over here and grief-oriented things over here. If you become really frozen on one side and you avoid grief, like you can't even think about it, you can't mention what's happened at all, you're totally incapacitated by grief. I think that's probably speaks more to a bit of a problematic grief with time. The time frame, it's a bit tricky because we say there's no time frame for grief, but I think it's about how incapacitated you are in what you're able to do with your life. But education around grief, I think, really helps. And that dual process model, you really, you can kind of, what I do as an activity with someone is we would write down together, well, what kinds of things are they doing to grieve? How are they expressing their grief? And then we would, on the other side of the butterfly, we would look at, well, what are you doing in life? Like, are you able to contact a friend, go out, do, some of those normal activities? And then kind of look, are you able to move back and forth? I think it's a good way of thinking about whether grief is problematic or not. So as far as how long, look, some people can start grieving several years after they have their initial grief, because if you've lost someone and you're having to do a lot of legalistic things, you don't always have the space to lament and grieve in the first year or two. Prolonged grief can ripple into other areas of your life. If you're not able to express your grief, it can happen, it can come into your relationships, into an inability to express your feelings. There are a lot of ways it can impact life. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question, Ian.
Great. Thank you so much, Judy. Very helpful. And you also touched in your answer on the dual process model. Maybe a question here for Greg, if you wanted to answer that. Dual process model of grief. There's a question here. Apparently not talked about much in Christian circles.
Judy, did you just, I think you were just, I think Judy was talking about that back and forth process, and it sounds like she's actually got a much better understanding of the framework than me. So I think she handled it pretty good. I'm not aware of any integration with biblical understandings. Michael, I don't know if you've come across that, or Judy, but yeah, I think you handled that question quite well, Judy.
I think with the dual process model, it's used a lot in grief. So people that have had specific grief counseling, grief training would be using that quite a lot because it's a great model. So I can see why she mentioned that she's done research around it, but I don't know of anything about the integration. So I'm really sorry that I can't provide more insight. I'm sure it's something we can look into, but I don't have that answer right now as to how it plays out with theological research. At this point.
I wonder if I don't know, Matt wants to talk about how that maps onto the Psalms, because it feels like in the Psalms there's that beautiful process of bouncing back and forth between, expression of deep pain and anger and, lament, but then talking about his joy in the Lord. So I don't know, Matt wants to maybe talk about how you can almost see the dual process, in the Psalms.
Yeah, I'm not hugely familiar with that terminology, but there is a strong sense of interaction in the Psalms. I mean, it's really interesting. Psalm 22 actually is a great example of that, where he says, my God, for why have you forsaken me? He expresses his grief, but there are these statements of, and yet you have been my God from, and yet, there's that, I guess that conversational aspect. And Psalms typically go through a lot. I mean, it's interesting, looking at those stages of grief. Psalms go through a lot of stages and in themselves, and including complaint. There's anger, and I think, yeah, there's a lot of healthy things going on there, and even the fact that these Psalms exist and they are there for us to reflect on, and in a sense, we through the Psalms we all join in a kind of common collective expression of grief over our predicament as humans, of which we all have our own taste at some point.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Here another question about, can you deal with grief, church, political issues where Christians hurt other Christians? Hard to call it grief, yet in leadership, you just have to keep going. Anyone would like to speak about that?
I'm happy being the pastor in the
room.
Yeah,
I think that's your question.
Christians hurt other Christians, and it's the inevitable, it's the inevitable aspect of community. Relationships bring out the best and the worst in us, and perhaps even the closer relationships go, the more they do that. Sometimes people abandon and actually both of those things are necessary for our growth. We need to have the best and the worst coming out. And so often people abandon relationships when they begin to see the worst in themselves, and they say things like, oh, that relationship wasn't working. And my response is that relationship's working just fine if that's that's what relationships do. And church is a forum where we learn to do relationships in a functional and Christ-centered, gracious sort of way. And so yes, it's inevitable that we will get hurt in a church environment. But it's how we work through that. That's the important thing. It's not like there's something terribly unusual or something wrong, unusually wrong with your church. If that happens, that's the normal. The important thing is how we all grow through that together. It was interesting. I heard a Melbourne pastor actually talk about he did a PhD thesis on unforgiveness in ministry. That he said, according to his research, one of the key causes of burnout for pastors was bitterness at their congregation, at their people, and an inability to deal in a functional way with the way that they're treated. So that's a big issue, and I think for us as pastors as well, we have to be up for that growth. We have to be the leading ones who are working through that in functional and helpful ways that allow us to grow.
Nice, great, thank you, Matt. Beautiful. And please, Judy and Greg and also Matt, I mean, leave your videos on. I think that's helpful, so I can see when you're waving with your hand. I know that someone wants to say something about the question. Here's an interesting question, really speaking or asking into this area of, okay, you have a friend who's grieving and you don't want to make a mistake, obviously. How do you speak to your friend, encouraging this friend and not leaving the friend worse off after you've left. Greg, maybe do you want to speak into that, or who's your professional experience?
Sure, I can start, and Judy wants to have a go at that as well. Yeah, look, it's always, I think it's always a hard thing when on a panel and you're answering a question like that, because like we said, like everyone's going to have their own meaning in their suffering, and so the way that we tend to someone, I think, is going to be different based on the context. I guess in some ways the safe answer, and I'm not trying to dodge or promise. I think it's probably having a self-reflection and understanding what our own anxieties might be, and how that might affect our ability to sit in the dust. That's the Job language, right? Sit in the dust with our friend. And so Esther, if you might be a person that is, and it's it's a lovely quality, not wanting to do damage, right? But if there's a fear of of breaking someone further, I mean, maybe that is the the thing to kind of wonder about, whether it might actually keep you from being with the person deeply and actually sitting with them in their pain. But look, that's me taking a guess, because there's always going to be context. But yeah, Judy on that, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think sort of a little bit of what you're touching upon. I can think about in my own situation that I think people were a little bit scared to say something because they're afraid they're going to make you sad or make it worse, but actually I was really sad, and probably, it was present whether they didn't think it was or not. So having someone that cared enough to want to be with me, or even if it was a silly question, it was still going to make me feel better, because I was in that place anyway. It wasn't going to just, bring more things up. But I think back to what I said in my time is just really being able to ask someone what they need, because they may not want to talk about their grief, or they may want to. And presence. And I think it can be really easy to want to fill the space when you feel uncomfortable, but really being able to listen and just let them say or do what they need to do, and to be able to sit with pain. It's tough. It can be tough, but you want to try and help to make someone feel better. That's like the natural inclination, but really just being able to listen, be present is helpful, I think. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, super important. Thank you, Judy and Greg. Now here's another interesting question. Sort of, can we prepare for seasons of grief? I mean, yes, reading Matt's book and listening to this webinar, these are great options. But what else can we do in order to, prepare ourselves for seasons of grief? Really important question. What anyone really who wants to start? I think you all could speak about that, so I'll leave it up to you.
I guess I can start, unless Matt, you look like you might be ready to. I think there's so many great resources to look at, such as grief.org, that has so many things that you can read. But I think the willingness to just explore and to look a little bit, to come alongside people, is like the starting point. To then, when you have your own experience, you're willing to share with others, and I think you're a bit more open. I think that reading about it is great. There are volunteer places like Griefline, who people are trained in grief to be able to listen to people, so they can call. Griefline is it's not 24 hours, but it's open a lot of hours of the day, especially the evening and night, when somebody might feel like they need to talk to someone. And at Griefline, they get training around grief so that you could know better how to support someone in their grief. But so many really helpful resources, like that one slide I shared with the websites, such as Grief Australia, and now they're not coming to me off my slide, but Cruise Bereavement Support in the UK. There's heaps of really great resources out there.
Great, thank you, Judy. Anyone wants to add anything?
I think I just love the Psalm so much. I keep wanting to reference Matt and just voice things over to him. But I was just going to say, maybe just one comment, and this is me as a psychodynamic therapist and thinking about, defense mechanisms. I think, for me, in terms of preparation, and it's, I guess, not having the expectation that suffering won't come, and I guess denying the fact that it will hurt and it will be painful. If in some ways we think that we can prepare for it in a sense that it won't significantly impact us, then it might actually lead us to have, unrealistic expectations. And so I guess, just not implementing any process of denial or any process of, keeping us away from the reality that, suffering will unfortunately, will come. Like Matt said, it's a part of a broken world, and I think, death is an intruder, but it will affect all of us. And
I think I felt that recently. I was diagnosed with cancer last year, and I was able to have surgery, but there was a little window of time there where I didn't really know how it was going to go, and I didn't know whether it's spread or not, or I've journeyed with a lot of people through that, and that has been actually, I know it sounds, I don't sort of want to instrumentalize those experiences, but it's been a blessing to me actually to enter those spaces of grief and draw from that, not try to give to that. I think sharing grief is the best way that you can help, I think, and I think it has, that along with a fairly robust biblical worldview, plus the experience of, going through, experiencing untimely deaths, and a good friend of mine passed away. Actually, one of the members of my band, Sons of Korah, actually the original drummer, died of cancer, and as a young man, and that had a very big effect, on us all, and so I think I expected, I never expected that I should be exempt. In fact, probably, if anything, I always slightly felt, why should I be exempt? And not that I wish that on myself, but when I had my own diagnosis, there was a sense of I was able to. I just felt I was set up for that well. It's never great. It's not a good experience, but the combination of that, of that worldview, I didn't feel entitled. There was no. I honestly, really, there was no why me. Really. But having gone on that journey with so many people, I felt that it set me up well, and the Psalms gave me a vocabulary to let it all out too. I probably know about 100 Psalms off by heart. So it's amazing what they do. How they shape the way that you pray and relate to God, and it's like the language of faith. It's like you learn to speak this language that takes things that are there and pulls them out, and lets them fly. And that's been important for me.
Thanks, Matt, for sharing. Here's a question about someone who wonders, okay, how can we grieve properly about those we don't really know that closely? Think about persecuted Christians. Think about those who are suffering in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine. What do we do? How do we deal with that? And I think to some extent we are grieving, but how do we process that? can we put that into language somehow? Judy,
I guess
Great.
it's again like it's there's so much you know, about personal context, and you know, for me, family of origin. But I guess just recently I had a client who was you know, talking about how weighed down they were by it. And for this particular person, they had a personality structure and a way of viewing themselves where they carried far too much burden for the suffering of others. And not that that's not a really lovely, virtuous thing, but I guess they lacked the and it wasn't a Christian, but they lacked the understanding that they're a limited creature. And I guess in one type of person, I guess it's understanding that we are you know, we're limited creatures. And I struggle with this. You know, you just, it's limitless the amount of people that you could try to help and want to try to be there for. But I guess understanding that that God, He's not limited, and that He will bring you know, judgment one day for evil. He will, you know, wipe the tears from our eyes. He is the perfect Father who you know, who will, you know, restore all things, and that isn't our while like Matt said, that we should grieve together to relieve ourselves of the burden that, you know, we need to fix it ourselves. But that's just for one type of person. So
I think I just add to that. I do think we've got to watch out. There's something unnatural about the amount of information that we receive, and the stories that we hear, and we've just got to be very careful that this doesn't sort of cause us to dissociate. And yeah, sometimes I am concerned about what happens to us when we're constantly confronted with this. It's not that we should avoid it. You know, I'm thinking of a book by Neil Postman that was written actually already back in the 80s. You know, it's kind of problematizing the information, the barrage of information that we get through the news, often a lot of tragedy. And his argument was that actually it's being turned into a form. I know this sounds strange, but it's his argument, and the book is a classic one now because it's a fairly compelling argument, is that it's essentially a form of entertainment. And the title of the book is Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he's concerned about the ways in which, you know, we habitually then relate to information, and that can have an adverse effect upon us. So I think there's a note of caution to sound there as well.
Thanks, Matt.
Can I just briefly comment on that? Sorry, I'm just really I agree. I'm like technology. I just think, yeah, we are getting flooded, and you know, just heard recently about these blue zones where people live the longest lives. And you know, for some people who they're not flooded and saturated by technology and news, and they, you know, sometimes for them, like the biggest, I guess, difficulty for them in a day is like, you know, an animal getting caught in a fence, and you know, they're having to solve that. But like, you know, you're saying, Matt, I think we're constantly bombarded by the problem of evil, and it's just it's too much to bear, I think. And yeah, definitely should dissociate, but I think we probably need to be wise about how much we get saturated by that.
And maybe here a question, thanks everyone, to your comment, Greg, where you talked about humor and whether that's a psychological defense mechanism for someone who's grieving. Someone wants to hear a little bit more about that. Maybe you can talk briefly about that.
Yeah, look, I mean, so I mean, in psychodynamic theory or psychoanalytic theory, humor is considered to be a mature psychological defense to manage pain and distressing emotions. I guess you know, it's all about context. So I think I probably made the comment that you have to be careful when somebody is grieving and they laugh with their pain, and there's an incongruence with what they're saying and their affect, or their emotional expression. You could be colluding with something there where they actually need someone to show them that they can sit in this together. Where if you just sort of laugh along, it's kind of denying that person's pain, and they never get to feel safe to show it. In terms of but humor more generally, like, I mean, I think there can be a relief in using humor at times. Probably the best eulogy I ever heard was like a beautiful eulogy, but it did end with a somewhat dark joke. But the joke still didn't deny the pain. So I guess humor, as long as it doesn't deny the pain, I think it's a helpful thing from I guess like a psychodynamic perspective, and I think a Christian one, hopefully.
Good. Thank you, Greg. Yes, Judy?
Sorry, I just wanted to add too. I think with grief, when you spend a lot of time with people who are grieving, you realize that to expect the unexpected in reactions. So, and something that might feel very abnormal for you, someone that I worked with once had actually ended up a few years before being hospitalized with a nervous breakdown, a mental health breakdown. And she was saying she had experienced the death of a parent or something due to an illness, cancer. And she never had grief education given to her, and she felt she was going crazy. So sometimes these reactions that happen for ourselves can feel like we might be going a little bit, it might feel so abnormal. But I think you have to expect the unexpected with grief, and what you're seeing, a laugh doesn't mean necessarily a laugh, but that you've already said.
Good. Thanks, Judy. And there's another question for you, I think, because I think it was in your talk where you mentioned Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's stages of grief. I think here's a question: what are common stages of grief and how do they manifest? Would you say a few things briefly if it's still fresh in your mind?
I think, like with Kübler-Ross's stages, I mean, I think it was always interpreted as being things that you had to go through, from like the bargaining, the anger, the bargaining, depression. That those were things that you had to go through sequentially, and that's why there's been so many other newer theories that kind of have replaced that thinking. Stages. So like stages of grief, William Worden, he talks about to accept the reality of the loss and to be able to process the pain of grief. So there are, what I'm trying to say is that there are different theories and different people that explain grief in different ways. And you wanted to know how they manifest. Well, depends on which model you're using to look at it. But it definitely manifests in recognizing that there are a lot of strong feelings that people, I think now, there's narrative therapy. People try to make sense, like they try to give expression to their grief. And I'm not sure what else I can say about. Do you want to add anything, either Matt or Greg, about the way grief manifests? I mean, you saw all that list that I shared with you, so many different ways that it manifests, and that can be at any stage, depending on where you are in your grief, that it can come out.
Yeah, I think, Judy, I think, look, I mean, I think you've explained it well, and I think you're, better equipped to deal with that type of framework, where I just think everyone's very different. And again, like from my framework, I guess I'll just take note of people's go-tos, when they're dealing with really distressing emotions, and I guess, overwhelming truths. But yeah, everybody's very different in my experience, and will implement different strategies, not so much, I guess, different stages. But yeah.
Mm. Great. Maybe one quick answer to one brief question here. The person here talks about the losses we experience when we age. Anything we can do here as we experience grief as we get older and lose resources? How do we deal with that?
Sorry, you go, Matt. Yep.
No, I was just going to say I'll leave that to the psychologists.
I don't know about that, but look, just yeah, I find that one a really difficult one. I've had a lot of experience with people who have Huntington's disease. I worked for them as a youth officer when I was studying, and I still get clients with that condition. And and I do get elderly people coming as clients as well. And find it a really, really difficult one because I haven't, like, I always try to find a piece of myself in the person I'm speaking to. And it's a really difficult one for me because, I'm very aware that I haven't experienced the degree of loss of functioning and I guess the frailty of that. I can only speak, I mean, maybe this isn't as a psychologist, it's as a Christian. Oh, look, I will link it to psychology actually. I guess my prayer to God is, sometimes when I go out and look at the stars at night when I'm feeling angsty is, God, when I'm, old and frail, if I am old and frail and, and I've lost my functioning and the things that I hold as, potentially idols and things that I rely upon, when I lose those things, I think I can manage if you're with me. If I know that you're with me, then I can do it. And I guess that maps onto psychology in a way because it's really big in attachment research that especially when we're at our most vulnerable, like as very young children, it's a mother's and parents, but primarily in the early stages, a mother's ability to hold the distress of their child, to feel the distress with the child, so not being cold and hard and maybe stoic, Matt, but feeling things, but still being able to hold themselves together to some extent, so the child feels held. And so I guess I guess when we are at our most frail and we're deteriorating, knowing that we have a Father who holds us in our frailty. I mean, in my mind, I haven't found a better psychological way to do it. So yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Greg, and thanks, Judy. Thank you, Matt, for your contributions this evening. Very profound, also very honest, speaking openly about your own experiences. Thank you for that. And I hope you all enjoyed this webinar, and where there's more on our website, more resources if you wish to see what we're up to. And for instance, we're running a new leadership program next year. Feel free to check that out. It's called Thrive. We're thinking about, thriving, flourishing, even in the midst of difficult circumstances, maybe even in times of grief, where we can still lead others and serve others. That's what we want to explore together. So yeah, good. Thank you for joining us. Have a good evening, and see you in one of our other workshops or webinars. God bless you all. Thank you.